Pripyat was young. Built beside the forests and rivers of northern Ukraine, it was a city created for one purpose alone: to serve the reactors of the Chernobyl nuclear power station. Nearly 50,000 people lived there. Engineers, teachers, factory workers, children. The average age was barely 26. To outsiders, Pripyat looked modern. Clean streets, new apartment blocks, schools filled with laughter, supermarkets stocked better than most Soviet cities. For many families, it felt like the future. And towering beside that future stood 4 nuclear reactors. Concrete giants producing electricity for millions across the Soviet Union. The pride of Soviet engineering. At least, that was the story. Because hidden inside Reactor Number 4 was a flaw few understood. And fewer still were willing to admit existed. Human civilization has always had a strange habit of believing complicated machines become harmless once enough officials approve them. Chernobyl would test that belief more brutally than anyone imagined. On April 25, 1986, engineers at the plant prepared for a routine safety test. The test itself sounded simple. If the station lost external power, could the spinning momentum of the turbine continue generating enough electricity to keep cooling systems active until emergency generators switched on? It was a question engineers had failed to answer several times before. The test had been delayed, postponed, repeated. But now, the managers wanted it completed. No more delays. Inside the control room of Reactor 4, operators began reducing power. Everything appeared normal. At first. The reactor they controlled was an RBMK 1000. A Soviet-designed nuclear reactor unlike those used in much of the West. It was powerful, efficient, and dangerously unstable under certain conditions. But Soviet operators were trained to trust the system. Trust the design. Trust the hierarchy above them. In the Soviet Union, doubt could be more dangerous to your career than radiation. That afternoon, the reactor's power reduction was unexpectedly halted. Officials in Kiev demanded electricity continue flowing into the grid. So the reactor remained operating for hours longer than planned. By the time the test resumed late that night, the experienced day shift had gone home. The night crew inherited the procedure instead. Tired men stepping into a situation already drifting out of control. Among them was Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. Strict. Intimidating. A veteran of the Soviet nuclear industry. Dyatlov demanded obedience. Failure was unacceptable. Beneath him worked younger operators, including Leonid Topchinov and shift supervisor Alexander Akhimov. Both competent. Both exhausted. Neither fully aware of how dangerous the reactor had become. At approximately 12:28 a.m., the operators made a mistake that changed history. Power inside the reactor dropped too low. Far too low. The nuclear reaction nearly died altogether. Inside the core, xenon gas accumulated rapidly. A phenomenon known as xenon poisoning. The reactor became unstable. The safe procedure would have been simple. Shut the reactor down completely. Cancel the test. Try again another day. But that would mean failure. Reports. Questions. Humiliation. So the operators pushed forward. Because institutions built on fear rarely reward caution. To restore power, operators withdrew control rods from the reactor core. More rods. Then more. Until the reactor entered a condition forbidden by safety regulations. Almost all operational safeguards had effectively been stripped away. The reactor was now unstable, poisoned, and vulnerable. Yet inside the control room, the test continued. The men there still believed they were in control. At 1:23 in the morning, the experiment began. Steam to the turbines was cut. Water flow changed throughout the reactor. Inside the core, physics began moving faster than human beings could follow. Power surged unexpectedly. The operators saw alarms. Readings fluctuated wildly. Confusion spread across the room. Then came the order. Emergency shutdown. AZ-5. The button designed to stop the reactor instantly. A final safeguard. The last defense. Akhimov pressed it. For one brief moment, they believed the crisis was over. But hidden inside the reactor's design was a catastrophic flaw. The control rods contained graphite tips. And when inserted into the reactor under unstable conditions, those graphite tips briefly increased reactivity instead of reducing it. In the final seconds before shutdown, Reactor 4 accelerated into disaster. Power exploded upward. Not gradually. Instantly. Fuel channels ruptured. Steam pressure tore through the reactor core. Then came the first explosion. A massive blast that lifted the 1,000-ton upper shield covering the reactor. Seconds later, a second explosion shattered the building itself. Concrete walls split apart. Steel twisted like wire. Burning graphite and radioactive debris erupted into the night sky. Reactor number 4 was gone. The core lay open to the atmosphere. Exposed. Burning. No reactor like this had ever exploded before. Many inside the plant refused to believe it had happened. Because the Soviet nuclear establishment had spent years insisting such a disaster was impossible. Reality disagreed. Violently. Outside, workers stared upward in disbelief. Some described a strange blue glow rising above the destroyed reactor. Ionized air interacting with unimaginable levels of radiation. Beautiful to look at. Deadly to stand beneath. Within minutes, firefighters arrived from Pripyat. They came expecting an ordinary electrical fire. None wore radiation suits. None understood what they were walking into. They climbed onto burning rooftops carrying hoses and axes. Some picked up fragments of graphite with bare hands, unaware they were touching pieces of the reactor core itself. Several later described a metallic taste in their mouths. One of the first symptoms of acute radiation exposure. Their bodies had already begun to die. They simply did not know it yet. Inside the station, confusion deepened. Akhimov and Topchinov continued trying to pump water into the reactor. Even after the explosion. Even after witnessing destruction around them. Because they could not accept the truth. The reactor was not damaged. It was gone. But admitting that meant admitting the impossible. And the Soviet system had trained its people never to believe impossible things could happen. Especially not under official supervision. Especially not in a nuclear power station meant to symbolize the triumph of Soviet science. As dawn approached, radioactive smoke drifted across the sleeping city of Pripyat. Children slept peacefully in their apartments. Parents prepared for work. Fishermen stood beside the river under invisible fallout. No alarm sounded in the city. No evacuation order came. The authorities still did not understand the scale of what had happened. Or perhaps worse. Some understood enough to stay silent. Because in the Soviet Union, information itself could become radioactive. And by sunrise on April 26, 1986, the most dangerous nuclear disaster in human history had only just begun. In the hours after the explosion, confusion ruled the Chernobyl nuclear power station. Plant managers struggled to understand what they were seeing. Meters failed. Communication lines collapsed. Radiation readings contradicted official assumptions. One dosimeter registered levels so extreme that operators dismissed it as broken. Because accepting the number meant accepting catastrophe. And catastrophe was something Soviet systems were never designed to admit. Inside Reactor Number 4, the graphite core continued burning. Temperatures climbed higher and higher. Every hour, the reactor released enormous quantities of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Iodine-131. Cesium-137. Strontium. Plutonium particles. Invisible poisons carried by the wind across Ukraine, Belarus, and eventually much of Europe. But in nearby Pripyat, life continued almost normally. People walked to bakeries. Children played outdoors. Couples pushed strollers beneath blooming trees. The city had no idea it was standing inside a radioactive cloud. Human beings are strangely vulnerable to invisible danger. Smoke causes panic. Blood causes panic. But radiation? Radiation waits politely while people continue their routines. At the hospital in Pripyat, doctors began receiving firefighters and plant workers. Many arrived vomiting. Some suffered severe burns unlike anything medical staff had seen before. Skin reddened rapidly. Faces swelled. Weakness spread through their bodies. Yet even then, few understood the true cause. The Soviet Union had prepared extensively for nuclear war. But almost no one was prepared for a civilian reactor disaster on this scale. Especially not one authorities still hesitated to acknowledge. Among the injured were the first firefighters to reach the reactor building. Men who had climbed directly onto radioactive debris without protection. They fought fires on rooftops surrounded by graphite blocks emitting lethal radiation. Some absorbed doses thousands of times higher than normal human limits. Yet many continued working until they physically collapsed. Not because they understood the danger. Because they believed people were depending on them. History tends to remember disasters through statistics. But disasters are always individual first. A hand gripping a fire hose. A man coughing blood in silence. Someone promising their family they'll return home by morning. At Chernobyl itself, senior officials argued over what had happened. Some insisted the reactor remained intact. Others demanded immediate evacuation. But Soviet bureaucracy moved carefully, even during catastrophe. Especially during catastrophe. No official wanted responsibility for declaring a nuclear emergency without authorization from Moscow. So while radioactive ash settled across the city, meetings continued. Forms were completed. Phone calls were made. Permissions were requested. Civilization often collapses in paperwork before it collapses physically. By morning, radiation levels in parts of Pripyat had risen dramatically. Yet schools remained open. Weddings continued. Children played beneath contaminated dust falling from the sky. Residents noticed strange things. A metallic taste in the air. Headaches. Nausea. Some stood on bridges at night watching the fire glow above the reactor. Unaware they were exposing themselves to deadly radiation. Years later, survivors would remember the beauty of it. The strange colors. The shimmering light. Human beings are tragically drawn toward spectacle, even when the spectacle is killing them. In Moscow, Soviet leaders received the first reports from Chernobyl. The information was incomplete. Contradictory. Sometimes absurd. One message claimed the reactor building remained mostly intact. Another warned of catastrophic core damage. The truth was almost too large to process. A nuclear reactor had exploded. Not in war. Not from attack. But during a routine safety test inside the Soviet Union itself. For decades, the Soviet state had presented nuclear technology as proof of ideological superiority. Chernobyl threatened not only lives, but credibility. And authoritarian systems fear humiliation almost as much as collapse. By midday on April 26, helicopters began flying over the reactor. Pilots reported impossible scenes below them. The roof destroyed. The core exposed. Fires burning with strange colors. Radiation levels so intense that onboard instruments malfunctioned. Some helicopter crews received enormous radiation doses in only a few passes. Still, they kept flying. Because someone had to look directly into the wound. Meanwhile, inside Pripyat, people prepared for the weekend. Children bought ice cream. Families opened windows against the spring heat. No public warning explained the danger. No announcement told residents to remain indoors. The silence itself became part of the disaster. Because radiation does not require panic to spread. Only time. Late that evening, the Soviet government finally formed a crisis commission. Leading it was Boris Sherbina, deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. A hard political operator with little nuclear expertise. He was joined by Valery Legasov, one of the Soviet Union's leading nuclear scientists. Unlike many officials, Legasov quickly understood the seriousness of the accident. An exposed reactor core meant continuous radioactive release. If the fire continued unchecked, contamination could spread across enormous regions. Potentially across Europe itself. The situation was no longer local. It was international. Possibly historic. When Sherbina and Legasov arrived near Chernobyl, they witnessed something deeply unsettling. Radiation readings climbed everywhere. Vehicles became contaminated. Soldiers worked without proper protection. And still, Many local officials continued minimizing the scale of the disaster. Because admitting reality meant admitting systemic failure. And systems built on denial rarely abandon it gracefully. That night, discussions turned toward evacuation. But evacuating an entire city was unprecedented. Nearly 50,000 people would need transportation, coordination, supplies. And once evacuated, they might never return. To Soviet authorities, that possibility carried terrifying political consequences. A perfect atomic city abandoned beside a destroyed reactor. A monument to technological failure. Still, radiation levels kept rising. And eventually, reality forced a decision ideology could not avoid. Pripyat would be evacuated. But not yet. Not until the following afternoon. For another full night, families slept beneath radioactive dust. Far above Europe, invisible contamination drifted westward. Into Belarus. Toward Poland. Toward Scandinavia. The Soviet Union still had not informed the world. But the world was already beginning to notice. Because radiation ignores borders. It ignores flags. It ignores propaganda. Atoms do not care what governments claim is impossible. And by the end of April 26, 1986, the disaster at Chernobyl was no longer merely a Soviet problem. It was becoming humanity's problem. For nearly 36 hours after the explosion, the city of Pripyat remained populated. Families ate breakfast. Children played outdoors. Residents walked beneath invisible radioactive particles drifting through the air. Some had already begun feeling ill. Nausea. Headaches. Fatigue. But few connected these symptoms to the reactor. Because almost nobody had been told the truth. Inside hospitals, conditions worsened rapidly. Firefighters and plant workers exposed during the first hours after the explosion deteriorated before doctors' eyes. Their skin darkened. Their bodies weakened. Many vomited continuously. Medical staff struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Acute radiation syndrome was something most Soviet doctors had studied only in theory. Now it was unfolding in crowded hospital rooms. In real time. At the reactor itself, emergency crews worked around the clock. Helicopters thundered overhead carrying sand, clay, boron, and lead. The goal was simple in theory. Smother the burning reactor core. Reduce radioactive emissions. Prevent an even larger catastrophe. But flying directly above the reactor exposed crews to lethal radiation. Pilots later described seeing the glowing crater beneath them. A torn wound in the earth radiating invisible death upward into the sky. Some flights lasted only seconds over the core. It was enough. Valery Legasov understood the danger better than almost anyone present. The reactor was not simply burning. It was unstable. Beneath the wreckage, molten nuclear fuel threatened to melt downward through concrete structures below the reactor. And beneath those structures sat enormous pools of water. If molten fuel reached them, a massive steam explosion could occur. One powerful enough to destroy the remaining reactors. One powerful enough to contaminate huge parts of Europe. For the first time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, scientists quietly contemplated the possibility of a disaster beyond calculation. Human beings had split the atom decades earlier. But fully controlling the consequences remained another matter entirely. By the afternoon of April 27, Soviet authorities could no longer delay evacuation. Buses began arriving from across the Kiev region. More than 1,000 in total. An enormous convoy lining roads outside the city. Residents watched from balconies, confused but calm. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed they would leave only for a few days. Others assumed there had been a chemical fire. Very few understood they were saying goodbye forever. At 1:10 p.m. loudspeakers crackled to life across Pripyat. The announcement was calm. Controlled. Reassuring. Residents were instructed to gather essential belongings and documents. They were told the evacuation would be temporary. Only 3 days. Take necessities. Lock your apartments. Remain orderly. The state would handle everything else. It was the final illusion Pripyat would ever receive. The evacuation began almost immediately. Families boarded buses carrying small bags and children in their arms. Pets were left behind. Laundry still hung from balconies. Meals remained on kitchen tables. Toys stayed scattered across apartment floors. An entire city paused mid-sentence. Frozen in ordinary life. Some residents noticed soldiers carrying radiation detectors. Others saw workers spraying streets with chemicals. But the scale of the disaster remained hidden. Even now, Soviet authorities feared panic more than exposure. Because governments often believe fear itself is more dangerous than truth. History repeatedly suggests otherwise. As buses departed, columns of vehicles stretched for kilometers. Nearly 50,000 people left the city within hours. Many looked back through bus windows toward the reactors. Toward the smoke rising in the distance. Toward the homes they expected to see again in a few days. Most never returned. Pripyat became a ghost city almost overnight. Not destroyed by war. Not emptied by famine. But abandoned because the environment itself had turned hostile to human life. Civilization depends on an invisible agreement with nature. Chernobyl shattered that agreement. Outside the exclusion zone, Soviet officials struggled desperately to contain information. No public admission fully explained the disaster. State television remained cautious. Newspapers vague. But the radiation cloud moving across Europe could not be censored. On April 28, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden detected unusual radiation on their clothing. At first, officials feared a leak at their own facility. Then they traced the contamination. The source pointed east. Toward the Soviet Union. Toward Chernobyl. The world was beginning to discover what Moscow still hesitated to admit. International pressure mounted quickly. Foreign governments demanded answers. Radiation readings appeared across Scandinavia and parts of Europe. Still, Soviet leadership delayed. Because acknowledging the truth meant exposing decades of secrecy, negligence, and institutional arrogance. And systems built on control rarely confess weakness voluntarily. Eventually, they are cornered into it by reality. Inside Moscow hospitals, the first severely irradiated firefighters and operators were transferred for specialized treatment. Doctors isolated them behind protective barriers. Not because radiation sickness is contagious, but because their immune systems were collapsing. Some victims appeared outwardly stable for brief periods, then suddenly worsened. Organs failed. Skin blistered. Internal tissues began breaking down. Radiation does not kill like fire or bullets. It dismantles the body slowly, cell by cell. A terrifyingly patient form of destruction. Meanwhile, thousands of soldiers, engineers, miners, and workers continued pouring into the Chernobyl zone. Most had little understanding of radiation. Many received minimal protective equipment. Yet they obeyed orders anyway. Some out of duty. Some out of fear. Some because refusing the Soviet state was rarely a simple option. History often remembers disasters through the decisions of leaders. But survival usually depends on ordinary people sent into impossible situations. By the end of April 27, Pripyat stood silent. Schools empty. Ferris wheel unmoving. Apartments abandoned with lights still on. Only the wind moved through the streets. And beyond the city, Reactor Number 4 continued burning, releasing contamination into the atmosphere hour after hour. The evacuation had saved tens of thousands. But the disaster itself was still far from contained. Because Chernobyl was no longer a single explosion. It had become a chain reaction of human error, political denial, and radioactive fallout spreading far beyond Ukraine. And the Soviet Union was about to discover that some catastrophes cannot be buried beneath silence. In the days after the explosion, Chernobyl became the center of the largest emergency operation in Soviet history. Military convoys flooded the exclusion zone. Helicopters crossed contaminated skies. Scientists, engineers, firefighters, and soldiers arrived by the thousands. Many had no clear understanding of what awaited them. Only that the state required their presence. And in the Soviet Union, refusal was rarely encouraged. Above Reactor Number 4, the situation remained catastrophic. The exposed core continued burning deep inside the destroyed building. Each hour released more radioactive material into the atmosphere. The graphite fire could not be extinguished with ordinary methods. Water was useless. Foam useless. Even approaching the reactor for long periods could prove fatal. Still, Soviet leadership demanded action. Because doing nothing in front of a disaster feels unbearable to governments. Even when nobody truly understands which actions might help. Helicopter crews received one primary mission. Drop materials directly into the reactor crater. Sand to smother the fire. Lead to absorb radiation. Boron to slow nuclear reactions. Clay and dolomite to suppress emissions. Day after day, helicopters flew low over the reactor. Pilots hovered above radiation levels so extreme that onboard instruments often failed. Some crews received dangerous doses within minutes. Yet flights continued constantly. From above, the reactor resembled a volcanic wound. Twisted steel. Burning graphite. Fragments of uranium fuel glowing beneath rubble. One pilot later described it as looking into the mouth of hell. Human beings do love dramatic metaphors after inventing things capable of poisoning continents. But another danger now haunted Soviet scientists. Beneath the reactor building sat flooded rooms filled with water. If molten nuclear fuel burned downward into those reservoirs, it could trigger a massive steam explosion. The blast might destroy the remaining reactors, contaminate much of Kiev, possibly render huge regions of Europe uninhabitable. Some estimates were likely exaggerated in hindsight. But at the time, uncertainty itself became terrifying. Because nobody had ever faced a disaster exactly like this before. To prevent catastrophe, engineers needed to drain the water beneath the reactor. There was one problem. The valves controlling the system were located inside highly radioactive flooded corridors beneath the building. Someone would have to enter manually. 3 men volunteered. Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, Boris Baranov. Armed with flashlights and protective suits offering little real defense, they descended into darkness. Water surrounded them. Pipes echoed through the corridors. Radiation levels climbed around them. For years, stories would claim the men knowingly sacrificed themselves on a suicide mission. The truth was more complicated. They understood the danger. But they also believed the task had to be done. Eventually, they found the valves. The water drained successfully. One disaster had been avoided. At least temporarily. Meanwhile, Moscow struggled to control international reaction. On state television, officials minimized the scale of the accident. Parades for May Day celebrations continued in Kiev despite rising radiation levels. Children marched beneath contaminated skies carrying Soviet flags and flowers. Because authoritarian systems often prioritize appearances long after reality becomes impossible to hide. Across Europe, radiation detectors continued sounding alarms. Farmers destroyed contaminated milk. Governments monitored food supplies. Citizens demanded information. And slowly, reluctantly, the Soviet Union admitted more details. Not out of transparency. Out of necessity. Radiation had crossed borders. The disaster could no longer remain domestic. Atoms, unlike politicians, are famously difficult to silence. At the reactor site, conditions worsened for many workers exposed during the first hours after the explosion. In Moscow Hospital No. 6, doctors fought desperately to save firefighters and plant operators suffering from acute radiation syndrome. Some victims lost skin tissue. Others suffered catastrophic internal damage. Hair fell out in clumps. Immune systems collapsed entirely. The body's own cells became the enemy. Radiation strips life apart at the molecular level. Slowly. Methodically. Cruelly. Among the dying were firefighters who had arrived believing they faced a normal industrial blaze. Men like Vasily Ignatenko and dozens of others who climbed burning rooftops without understanding the invisible danger surrounding them. Many were in their 20s. Some newly married. Most never fully understood why their bodies failed so rapidly afterward. They had been sent to fight a fire. Instead, they walked directly into the core of a nuclear catastrophe. Back at Chernobyl, Soviet authorities confronted another grim reality. The reactor roof remained covered with highly radioactive debris. Graphite blocks. Fuel fragments. Contaminated metal. Before construction of a protective structure could begin, the debris needed removal. Machines were sent first. Robots from the Soviet Union. Robots from West Germany. Most failed almost immediately. Radiation destroyed electronics within minutes. The machines stalled. Crashed. Stopped responding. So the Soviet Union turned to the oldest technology available. Human beings. Thousands of conscripted soldiers and workers, later known as liquidators, were sent onto the reactor roofs. Their instructions were brutally simple. Run onto the roof. Shovel radioactive debris over the edge. Run back. Most exposures lasted less than 2 minutes. Longer could prove deadly. The men called the roof the most dangerous place on Earth. Because for a brief period, it truly was. Some workers laughed nervously before sprinting forward. Others crossed themselves. Many later suffered severe health problems. Yet at the time, most were treated as replaceable components in a massive state operation. Civilizations often reveal their deepest values during emergencies. Chernobyl revealed how expendable individuals could become when institutions panic. As weeks passed, the Soviet Union slowly gained partial control over the disaster. Radiation emissions decreased. The fires weakened. But the reactor remained deadly. An open wound leaking contamination into the environment. Scientists warned that the destroyed core would remain hazardous for centuries. Long after governments changed. Long after flags disappeared. Long after the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. And surrounding the reactor stood an expanding exclusion zone. Villages emptied. Forests contaminated. Farmland abandoned. Entire communities erased from maps because invisible particles had settled into soil and water. The nuclear age had promised limitless energy. Instead, Chernobyl revealed another truth. Human technology had advanced faster than human wisdom. And now thousands of people were risking their lives simply to contain the consequences of that imbalance. More than 500,000 people would eventually participate in the cleanup operation at Chernobyl. Soldiers. Miners. Firefighters. Engineers. Pilots. Doctors. Factory workers. Young conscripts barely old enough to shave. All sent into contaminated territory to contain the worst nuclear disaster humanity had ever created. Some volunteered. Others received orders. Many did not fully understand the danger. The Soviet state rarely explained everything to the people expected to solve its problems. The exclusion zone surrounding Chernobyl expanded rapidly. Villages disappeared behind military checkpoints. Roads emptied. Homes stood abandoned with dishes still on tables and photographs still hanging on walls. Entire communities vanished almost overnight. In some places, radiation levels remained so high that a few hours outdoors could become dangerous. Yet life still moved strangely through the zone. Dogs wandered empty streets. Cows grazed contaminated fields. Forests absorbed radioactive fallout silently, tree by tree. Nature does not panic. It simply adapts to whatever human beings release into it. Even when humans themselves cannot. At Reactor Number 4, construction began on a massive concrete shelter. The Soviets called it the sarcophagus. Its purpose was brutally simple. Seal the destroyed reactor before winter arrived. Before another collapse released more contamination. Before rain carried radioactive material deeper into groundwater. The structure needed to be built at extraordinary speed. And that meant exposing workers to enormous danger. Before construction could continue, the roofs around the reactor still needed clearing. Radioactive graphite and fuel fragments covered the area. Robots had failed repeatedly. Radiation destroyed electronics almost instantly. So officials relied on men instead. Again. Liquidators were sent onto rooftops in small teams. Each worker received roughly 90 seconds. Sometimes less. They sprinted across blackened surfaces carrying shovels. Grab debris. Throw it over the edge. Run back. That was the entire mission. Simple enough to explain. Terrifying enough to remember forever. Some workers wore improvised lead protection. Heavy aprons. Lead sheets sewn into caps. Crude equipment offering limited safety against radiation powerful enough to penetrate concrete walls. One liquidator later described the experience as running across the surface of the sun. Others recalled hearing the clicking of dosimeters accelerate into frantic static. The sound of invisible particles tearing through the world around them. And through them. Many liquidators coped through humor. Dark jokes spread constantly through the zone. About glowing in the dark. About becoming radioactive heroes. About surviving long enough to collect medals from officials who remained safely distant from the reactor itself. Human beings have always joked in disasters. Sometimes because courage exists. Sometimes because terror becomes unbearable otherwise. Far beneath the reactor, another crisis unfolded. Scientists feared the molten nuclear fuel might continue melting downward into the earth. To prevent groundwater contamination, miners from across the Soviet Union were brought to Chernobyl. Their mission: dig a tunnel beneath Reactor 4. The conditions were brutal. Extreme heat. Poor ventilation. Radiation exposure. Many miners eventually worked nearly naked underground because temperatures became unbearable. They dug around the clock beneath one of the most contaminated places on Earth. Not for glory. Not for ideology. Simply because someone had to do it. History survives mostly because exhausted people continue doing impossible jobs anyway. While cleanup operations continued, Soviet authorities launched an enormous decontamination campaign. Roads were buried beneath fresh asphalt. Topsoil was removed from villages. Forests were cut down. Buildings washed repeatedly with chemical solutions. Yet radiation remained stubbornly unpredictable. One patch of ground could appear relatively safe. A few meters away, contamination levels spiked dramatically. Invisible particles settled unevenly across fields, rooftops, rivers, and forests. Creating pockets of danger scattered across the landscape. Chernobyl transformed geography itself into uncertainty. In Kiev, life continued with uneasy normality. Official statements reassured the public. Television broadcasts emphasized control and stability. But rumors spread everywhere. People whispered about radiation sickness. About contaminated food. About secret casualty numbers. Trust in Soviet leadership began eroding rapidly. Because disasters expose weaknesses propaganda cannot fully conceal. Especially when radiation detectors start confirming the rumors. Internationally, Chernobyl shocked the world. Western governments demanded transparency. Scientists questioned Soviet reactor design. News broadcasts showed maps of radioactive contamination drifting across Europe. For many outside the Soviet Union, Chernobyl became proof that nuclear power itself was fundamentally unsafe. Inside the Soviet Union, it became something even more dangerous. A symbol of institutional dishonesty. Because the explosion alone did not destroy public confidence. The secrecy afterward did. Valery Legasov increasingly found himself trapped between science and politics. He understood the technical realities of the disaster. But he also understood the Soviet system's instinct to protect itself. At international conferences, Soviet officials often minimized design flaws in the RBMK reactor. Legasov knew the truth was more complicated. And more frightening. The disaster had not been caused solely by operator mistakes. The reactor itself contained dangerous instabilities hidden for years beneath bureaucratic denial. Chernobyl was not merely human error. It was systemic failure. Engineered slowly over decades. As summer turned toward autumn, the sarcophagus finally rose over Reactor Number 4. A massive steel and concrete structure built under impossible conditions. Hundreds of thousands of tons assembled by workers exposed to constant radiation. The shelter reduced emissions significantly. But it was never intended as a permanent solution. Too rushed. Too unstable. Even while being completed, engineers knew it would eventually deteriorate. A temporary tomb for a permanent problem. By late 1986, the Soviet government officially declared the reactor contained. But nothing about Chernobyl truly ended. Not for the workers. Not for evacuated families. Not for contaminated regions across Eastern Europe. Radiation would remain in forests and soil for generations. Some isotopes for centuries. Others for thousands of years. Human civilization tends to think politically in years. Nature measures consequences differently. And scattered across the Soviet Union were the liquidators themselves. Men returning home with medals, illnesses, fears, and unanswered questions. Many would later struggle for recognition. Others would disappear quietly into statistics. Yet without them, the disaster might have become unimaginably worse. They were sent to fight an enemy they could not see. An enemy without sound, smell, or mercy. And for a brief moment in history, the survival of entire regions depended on ordinary people carrying shovels onto a radioactive roof. For decades, the Soviet Union had survived through control. Control of information. Control of industry. Control of truth itself. Mistakes were hidden. Failures rewritten. Disasters minimized. The state projected certainty because certainty maintained authority. But Chernobyl was too large to conceal completely. Radiation had crossed borders. Foreign scientists detected contamination. Western newspapers published satellite images. And millions of Soviet citizens began asking dangerous questions. What else had they not been told? In Moscow, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev faced mounting pressure. Gorbachev had come to power promising reform. Perestroika. Glasnost. Restructuring and openness. But Chernobyl exposed how deeply secrecy still infected the Soviet system. Local officials concealed information. Plant managers denied reality. Bureaucrats delayed decisions while radiation spread across Europe. Every level of authority feared blame more than catastrophe. And fear is a terrible operating system during emergencies. For nearly 3 weeks after the explosion, Gorbachev avoided addressing the nation directly. When he finally spoke on television, the message was carefully controlled. The Soviet Union, he insisted, had faced the crisis responsibly. Western criticism was exaggerated. Panic unnecessary. But by then, public trust had already begun collapsing. Because once people realize they have been lied to during disaster, they start reconsidering everything else. History. Institutions. Authority itself. Meanwhile, scientists investigating the accident uncovered disturbing truths about the RBMK reactor design. The positive void coefficient. The graphite-tipped control rods. The unstable behavior at low power. These flaws had been known, at least partially, within sections of the Soviet nuclear industry for years. Warnings existed. Concerns had been raised. Yet major redesigns were delayed or ignored. Because acknowledging flaws would disrupt schedules, budgets, and political prestige. And bureaucracies everywhere possess a remarkable ability to postpone reality until reality explodes. Sometimes literally. Inside the Soviet nuclear establishment, blame shifted rapidly. Officials searched for individuals to hold responsible. The narrative became simple. Operators violated procedures. Human error caused the disaster. Case closed. But the truth refused to stay simple. Yes, mistakes had occurred. Serious mistakes. But the reactor itself had transformed those mistakes into catastrophe. A safer design might have survived the test. Chernobyl did not result from one bad decision. It resulted from layers of denial accumulating over years. Like pressure inside a reactor core. In August 1986, Soviet representatives appeared before the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. Among them was Valery Legasov. For days, Soviet scientists presented technical explanations of the disaster to the world. Legasov spoke openly about many details. More openly than Soviet officials normally allowed. International experts listened carefully. Some admired his honesty. Others sensed omissions. Because even then, the full truth about reactor design flaws remained politically dangerous. Still, the meeting marked a turning point. For the first time, the Soviet Union publicly admitted major failures within its nuclear system. Chernobyl had forced openness upon a state built on controlled narratives. Back inside the exclusion zone, cleanup operations continued relentlessly. Entire villages were bulldozed and buried. Contaminated forests were cut down. Topsoil removed. Machinery abandoned after becoming radioactive. The zone became a strange landscape where ordinary objects transformed into hazards. A child's toy. A fire helmet. A bus seat. Dust itself. Civilization had created a form of contamination that could linger longer than memory. Wildlife slowly returned to abandoned regions around the reactor. Wolves moved through empty streets. Birds nested inside deserted buildings. Trees grew through cracked concrete. Without humans present, nature reclaimed territory rapidly. It was beautiful and unsettling. Chernobyl became proof that the natural world could survive humanity's mistakes more easily than humanity could. A deeply humbling observation for a species that enjoys calling itself dominant. For evacuated families, life became fragmented. Many were relocated to unfamiliar cities. Apartment blocks filled with displaced residents. Communities dissolved almost overnight. Some people carried official documents identifying them as victims of Chernobyl. Others concealed their origins entirely. Fear of contamination spread socially as well as physically. People worried about illness, infertility, birth defects. Invisible exposure became psychological too. Anxiety itself entered daily life. Thousands of liquidators developed health problems in the years following the disaster. Some suffered severe radiation-related illnesses. Others endured chronic fatigue, heart disease, immune disorders, and psychological trauma. Precise numbers became controversial. Politics contaminated medical research almost as thoroughly as fallout contaminated the forests. Governments minimized. Activists exaggerated. And many ordinary people were left somewhere in between, carrying bodies changed by exposure and uncertainty. Radiation is terrifying partly because it resists simple storytelling. Not everyone exposed dies immediately. Not everyone survives untouched. The damage unfolds slowly across time. Quietly. Unevenly. Among those most haunted by Chernobyl was Valery Legasov himself. He had witnessed the reactor firsthand. He understood the scale of institutional failure. And increasingly, he felt trapped inside a system unwilling to confront the full truth. Privately, Legasov recorded audio tapes describing the disaster and criticizing Soviet secrecy. He believed lessons were being ignored. That the culture responsible for Chernobyl remained largely intact. 2 years after the explosion, on April 26, 1988, Legasov took his own life. His death shocked many colleagues. But his recordings survived. And through them, his warnings endured. By the late 1980s, Chernobyl had become more than a nuclear accident. It became a symbol of technological arrogance, of bureaucratic paralysis, of political dishonesty. For many historians, the disaster accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Not because radiation destroyed the state physically, but because Chernobyl shattered the illusion that the system was fundamentally competent. And once that illusion broke, millions began questioning everything else. Empires survive military defeat surprisingly often. What they struggle to survive is the loss of belief. Yet even after all the investigations, reports, and testimonies, one reality remained painfully clear. The people who suffered most were often the ones least responsible. Firefighters, workers, families, children evacuated from homes they would never see again. Ordinary lives pulled into catastrophe by decisions made far above them. As happens so often in history. as humans somehow continue allowing. In the years following the disaster, the Chernobyl exclusion zone became one of the strangest places on Earth. A territory abandoned by people, but not by time. 30 kilometers of forests, rivers, roads, and empty cities sealed away behind checkpoints and warning signs. An accidental kingdom of decay. Built not by war. Not by plague. But by invisible particles released in less than 10 catastrophic seconds. At the center of the zone stood Pripyat. Frozen in 1986. Apartment blocks still filled with furniture. Classrooms abandoned mid-lesson. Children's toys scattered across dusty floors. Amusement park rides rusting beneath open skies. Nature moved steadily through the city. Trees burst through concrete. Vines wrapped around balconies. Foxes wandered through supermarkets. Rain entered buildings humans once believed permanent. Civilization disappears surprisingly fast once maintenance stops. The apocalypse, it turns out, often looks less like explosions and more like water leaking through ceilings. Inside many apartments, traces of ordinary life remained untouched. Photographs. Letters. Winter coats hanging beside doors. Calendars still open to April 1986. The evacuation had happened so quickly that most residents believed they would return within days. Few imagined they were leaving forever. Entire human lives interrupted without conclusion. No final goodbye. Just absence. Radiation levels across the zone varied wildly. Some areas became relatively safe over time. Others remained dangerously contaminated decades later. Hot spots hid in forests, basements, and patches of soil. Invisible hazards waiting patiently beneath leaves and dust. Unlike fire or flood, radiation leaves landscapes appearing deceptively normal. Birds still sing. Grass still grows. Sunlight still falls beautifully across abandoned streets. The danger cannot be seen. And human beings are deeply uncomfortable fearing what they cannot perceive. Scientists returned repeatedly to study the zone. Biologists examined plants and animals exposed to long-term contamination. Some species declined sharply after the disaster. Others adapted unexpectedly well. Wolf populations increased. Birds nested in abandoned structures. Wild horses roamed empty fields. Without humans present, ecosystems reclaimed territory rapidly. Chernobyl became an uncomfortable reminder that nature often suffers less from radiation than from civilization itself. A rather embarrassing observation for humanity, honestly. Yet the recovery was never entirely natural. Mutations appeared in some plants and insects. Certain regions remained biologically damaged. Contaminated water systems required monitoring. And buried beneath the sarcophagus lay hundreds of tons of radioactive material still capable of causing future danger. The disaster had not ended. It had merely slowed into geological time. The original sarcophagus surrounding Reactor Number 4 began deteriorating almost immediately after construction. It had been built under impossible conditions. Rushed. Improvised. As temporary as a structure covering a destroyed nuclear reactor could possibly be. Cracks formed. Water leaked inside. Engineers feared partial collapse. And beneath it all remained the melted fuel mass known as corium. A lava-like mixture of nuclear fuel, concrete, sand, and metal formed during the meltdown. In some rooms beneath the reactor, it hardened into grotesque formations. Black. Glass-like. Still radioactive decades later. Humanity had accidentally invented geological horrors previously reserved for science fiction. One formation became especially infamous. A dense mass discovered beneath the reactor called the elephant's foot. So radioactive that early photographs could be taken only briefly before cameras failed. Standing near it for minutes could deliver lethal exposure. Even years later, it remained one of the most dangerous objects on Earth. A monument to physics operating without restraint. Beyond the exclusion zone, the effects of Chernobyl spread through generations. Hundreds of thousands of people remained displaced. Large regions of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia suffered long-term contamination. Thyroid cancer rates rose sharply among children exposed to radioactive iodine. Fear itself became hereditary. Parents worried about birth defects. About food safety. About illnesses hidden inside their DNA. Because radiation contaminates more than land. It contaminates trust in the future. Politically, Chernobyl continued reshaping history long after the reactor stopped burning. The disaster accelerated public distrust across the Soviet Union. Citizens increasingly questioned official narratives. Environmental movements grew stronger. Demands for transparency spread. And only 5 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Many historians would later describe Chernobyl as the moment the Soviet system began dying in public view. Not instantly, but irreversibly. A state built on secrecy had encountered a disaster secrecy could not contain. For survivors, memory remained deeply personal. Former residents of Pripyat spoke about dreams of returning home. Liquidators remembered the smell of graphite fires and helicopter fuel. Firefighters' families carried photographs of young men who never understood why they were sent onto radioactive rooftops with almost no protection. And scattered across Eastern Europe were millions of quieter stories. Small losses history books rarely record. Cancelled weddings. Abandoned pets. Family albums left behind forever inside poisoned apartments. Disasters become historical events only from a distance. Up close, they are individual heartbreaks repeating thousands of times. In 2000, the last functioning reactor at Chernobyl finally shut down. The station ceased producing electricity. But the site itself remained dangerous. Massive international projects began constructing a new containment structure over Reactor 4. An enormous steel arch large enough to cover entire stadiums. Built to confine radioactive material for generations to come. Not permanently. Nothing at Chernobyl is truly permanent. Only longer lasting. Human civilization often measures success by election cycles and quarterly reports. Radiation prefers half-lives lasting centuries. Today, tourists visit parts of the exclusion zone under controlled conditions. They walk through silent schools. Photograph abandoned Ferris wheels. Stand beside empty apartment towers reclaimed by trees. Chernobyl has become part memorial, part warning, part spectacle. Human beings are drawn toward ruins. Especially ruins created by their own ambition. Perhaps because deep down, civilizations understand they are fragile. And places like Chernobyl force us to confront that fragility directly. But beneath every documentary image and every radiation map lies a simpler truth. Chernobyl was never only about technology, or nuclear energy, or the Soviet Union. It was about human behavior. About arrogance. About secrecy. About institutions convincing themselves impossible things cannot happen. Until they do. Because the reactor exploded in seconds. But the conditions that caused it were built slowly over years. Through ignored warnings. Compromised safety. Fear of speaking openly. And faith in systems that demanded obedience over honesty. Those patterns did not vanish with the Soviet Union. Which is the truly uncomfortable part. The forests around Chernobyl still grow. The rivers still flow. Wind still moves through the empty streets of Pripyat. And somewhere beneath layers of steel and concrete, the remains of Reactor Number 4 still wait. Silent now. But not harmless. A buried reminder of what happens when human power outruns human wisdom. For decades after the disaster, the name Chernobyl became synonymous with catastrophe. A single word carrying images of abandoned cities, radiation suits, and burning reactors. But memory simplifies disasters. Reality is always more complicated. Chernobyl was not created by one mistake. Not by one man. Not by one flawed machine. It emerged from an entire culture of silence, pressure, fear, and ambition. A chain reaction inside human institutions long before it became a chain reaction inside a reactor core. The Soviet Union had believed itself unstoppable. A technological superpower. A political giant. A nation capable of conquering space itself. Yet at Chernobyl, the system failed at its most basic responsibility. Protecting its own people. Warnings were ignored. Safety concerns minimized. Operators placed under impossible pressure. Information delayed while civilians remained exposed. Again and again, reputation mattered more than reality. Civilizations rarely collapse because they lack intelligence. They collapse because they convince themselves they are incapable of failure. In the years after the accident, debates over nuclear energy intensified across the world. Some countries slowed or halted reactor construction. Others redesigned safety systems entirely. Engineers studied Chernobyl obsessively. Every procedure. Every alarm. Every fatal decision made during those final minutes. Because disasters become textbooks written in human suffering. And future generations either study them carefully or repeat them. Humanity has demonstrated enthusiasm for both options. The RBMK reactors themselves were modified after the explosion. Control rod designs changed. Automatic shutdown systems improved. Operational procedures rewritten. The flaws exposed by Chernobyl could no longer remain hidden. Too many people had died. Too much contamination had spread across Europe. The cost of denial had become measurable from space. And still, nuclear energy did not disappear. Because despite the fear surrounding radiation, the world's hunger for power only grew larger. Modern civilization depends on energy constantly. Cities. Factories. Hospitals. Communication networks. Everything requires electricity. And every method of producing it carries consequences. Coal poisons the air. Oil reshapes climates. Dams flood landscapes. Nuclear reactors generate waste capable of outliving empires. Human progress has always involved bargaining with danger. Chernobyl simply revealed what happens when those bargains are managed recklessly. For survivors, however, the disaster was never philosophical. It was personal. Former residents of Pripyat grew old far from home. Children exposed to fallout became adults carrying medical uncertainty through their lives. Liquidators struggled with illness, trauma, and forgotten promises from the state they served. Some were celebrated briefly as heroes. Many were quietly abandoned afterward. History often praises sacrifice more enthusiastically than it supports survivors. Among the most enduring symbols of the disaster remained the firefighters. The first men to arrive at Reactor 4. Workers who climbed burning rooftops believing they faced an industrial accident. Not an open nuclear core. Many died painful deaths within weeks. Others suffered for years afterward. Yet without their actions during those first chaotic hours, the catastrophe might have spread even further. They fought an enemy invisible to human senses. And they fought it almost blindly. Valery Legasov's warnings also endured long after his death. His recordings revealed deep frustration with the Soviet system's refusal to confront uncomfortable truths. He understood something larger than reactor physics. Technology alone had not caused Chernobyl. Human behavior had. Secrecy. Arrogance. Institutional fear. The belief that admitting weakness threatened authority more than actual danger did. Those conditions are not uniquely Soviet. Which is why Chernobyl still matters. In 2016, a massive new steel structure was moved into place over Reactor 4. The new safe confinement. One of the largest movable structures ever built. Designed to contain radiation and allow dismantling of the old sarcophagus beneath it. An engineering achievement created to imprison the consequences of an earlier engineering failure. Humanity solving problems created by humanity. The species does spend remarkable amounts of time cleaning up after itself. Today, parts of the exclusion zone remain strangely peaceful. Forests cover old roads. Birdsong echoes through abandoned schools. Apartment towers crumble slowly beneath weather and time. Nature continues reclaiming the ruins. Not because nature forgives. Because nature simply continues. Indifferent to ideology. Indifferent to borders. Indifferent to human ambition. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Chernobyl. The atom itself was never evil. Physics was never evil. The reactor did exactly what the laws of nature allowed it to do. The disaster emerged from human choices. Choices shaped by pride. Fear. Bureaucracy. And the dangerous belief that systems become safe merely because people insist they are. Chernobyl remains one of the clearest warnings modern civilization has ever received. A warning about power without transparency. About expertise silenced by politics. About leaders who fear embarrassment more than catastrophe. And about ordinary people forced to bear the consequences afterward. The reactor exploded at 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986. But the forces that caused it existed long before that night. And they still exist now. In governments. In corporations. In institutions where speaking honestly remains dangerous. That is why Chernobyl still feels frightening decades later. Not because the disaster was unimaginable. Because it was entirely human.